My mom woke me up and told me the FBI was at the door. Or the story of how intelligence agencies drove the first hacker to commit suicide after breaking into the Pentagon. A 24-year-old man sat at his desk, jaggedly scribbling the fourth page of his letter on a ruled sheet of paper torn from somewhere. It had been a hot day in his hometown of Pinecrest, a suburb of Miami, Florida, and by late afternoon, the thermometer read plus 26 Celsius, so he had to open a window. The letter was almost ready. He had to give passwords to his MySpace and PayPal accounts, and of course, to his router. He'd composed this note with almost no flaws, except in one place. He'd crossed out the beginning of a sentence to start it on the next page. The line, "My last will," underlined. But the contents of that page never leaked to the press. He had once achieved everything at this desk, and a couple of weeks ago, when they came to search his house again, he had lost everything. 9 years before that night, in June 1999, 15-year-old Jonathan James was committing the second major break-in of his life. He had spent almost all his free time online trying to find vulnerable servers on his Pentium 266 that he could bypass security systems. His search led him to a vulnerable computer in Huntsville, Alabama. By setting up a remote connection, the teenage hacker infected the device with malware that allowed James to escalate his level of permissions on the system. This gave him access to 13 other computers. They were all part of a network belonging to the Marshall Space Center, NASA's premier research institute. James opened file after file and couldn't believe his eyes. In front of him were mock-ups and test results of secret rocket engines, descriptions of communication systems, and even the program's source code that controlled critical life support elements of the International Space Station, which had been launched a little over half a year ago. It was through the programs accessed by Jace that the ISS maintained a habitable environment, including controlling temperature and humidity. 6 months later, during the trial, it was discovered that the US government spent $1.7 million to write this code. James himself assessed the fruits of the NASA developers' labors somewhat skeptically. "Did I change anything in the source code?" "No," James stated in a later interview. "It was an environmental control program. Why would I want to do that? To play with space conditioning?" That said, the code itself was pretty crap, and it certainly wasn't worth $1.7 million. James claimed that the only reason he downloaded the code for the NASA program was curiosity. Plus, the project was written in the same programming language the teenager was interested in. What could be more fascinating than reading program code written by the government? He said, when the hack was discovered, responsible NASA officials were immediately put on alert. Marshall Center systems were shut down for 3 weeks to analyze the causes and chronology of the hack. It caused NASA a direct loss of $41,000. All information about the hacking attack was immediately passed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, so that special agents could locate the unknown and apparently powerful cybercriminal who was quietly going to school at the time. But this is a partial list of his accomplishments. He made history as the man who was able to be the first to hack into the Pentagon. A couple of months before breaking into NASA's systems, James, who used the internet pseudonym C0MR8, first went far beyond his high school computer course. He had been hacking before, but then he had his first big break. He managed to get into the systems of AT&T Bell South, one of the largest telecoms companies in the US, and the corporation itself learned about the abuse of its own security systems only in early 2000 from James's testimony in court. Having learned the taste of the first victories, C0 Murad did not think to calm down. In September 1999, he discovered that someone had installed a Trojan on a server in Dulles, Virginia, now part of the metropolitan area, that allowed virtually anyone to connect to the server. At the time, the teenage hacker was unaware that the system was run by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, part of the U.S. Department of Defense. Its main task was to counter external threats to the country's national security, but the military was incapable of dealing with internal threats. Not thinking long, James installed a particular program on the server that intercepted and analyzed the traffic passing through it, This hunt was remarkably successful. The teenager found out the credentials of the Ministry of Defense employees and gained access to 10 more computers. From there, he downloaded more than 3.3 thousand e-readers and a bunch of classified information. The hack is believed to be the first Pentagon hack, at least among those recognized in Washington. It turns out that you can control the computers that military and employees of government agencies or large corporations sit at without any problem. And if you know what you're doing, you can surf the internet without restriction wherever your soul desires. Traveling online like that gives you a special power, James later said of the hack. In his travels through the forbidden parts of the internet, the hacker, like many of his followers among amateur cybercriminals, failed to take into account one thing: his own anonymity. Being able to penetrate the most secret corners of state networks, he did not worry about the traces he left behind. They were enough to trace James back to January 2000. How did his parents react to this? The hacker's father, Robert James, admitted a year after his son's death that he was even a little proud of his achievements in cyber hacking. It was he, being a programmer, who opened up the digital world to the child. By the age of 6, James Jr. was already an avid computer enthusiast and would sit for hours playing games on the family PC. He then suddenly began to learn first how to bypass parental control programs on computers and then programming languages. When James was 13, he uninstalled the Windows operating system, replacing it with Linux, which was more popular with professionals and developers. The child's obsession with high technology was a perpetual cause for quarrels between his parents. Jonathan's mother did not want her son to sit at the computer until late at night. His father, on the other hand, indulged his hobbies, seeing him as an extension of himself. One day, his mother was defeated, and the future hacker's computer was taken away. He ran away from home. After this, he gave an ultimatum in a telephone conversation. "I'll come back when the technology returns." His parents eventually found James Jr. in a shop on their own street, but his condition still had to be honored. "Sometimes I thought he was pretty smart," Robert James admitted. "And sometimes I thought I'd raised an idiot. I confess I never knew what the right answer was." All these years, the boy's parents worried that the days and weeks spent near the computer will be reflected in poor grades at school. And each time, they were surprised by Jonathan's high academic performance. The truth came out when he was tried. It turned out that the novice hacker had long ago hacked into the network of educational institutions in the district and systematically corrected his grades there. How was Jonathan's first detention? Jonathan James's life changed dramatically on January 26, 2000, when his mother opened the door and saw armed men from the FBI and the Department of Defense behind it. During the search of the house, 4 personal computers, a laptop, and 1 PDA were seized. James agreed to cooperate with the investigation, and his defense insisted that the hacker did not take any actions that would harm NASA, the Ministry of Defense, or corporations, but only studied the documents obtained as a result of the hacking. The teenager also managed to prove that on at least several occasions, he wrote to the information security departments of the companies affected by his actions, not only pointing out the existence of problems, but also suggesting ways to fix them. However, he has yet to receive a response. James also benefited from the fact that he committed his crimes when he was 15 years old. If he had been a year older, he would have gone to prison for at least 10 years and paid a considerable fine. In the end, James got off lightly enough. The court sentenced the hacker to a 6-month house arrest with a ban on recreational computer use, followed by 2 years probation. In addition, the hacker had to apologize in writing to NASA and the U.S. Department of Defense. "I never believed they would come to my house. It was a complete shock to me." James later recalled a few weeks later, the police detained Jonathan on the street. This meant that he had broken the conditions of his house arrest. Moreover, drugs were found in his blood. At that moment, his suspended sentence turned into a real one. It was the first time in U.S. history that a teenager had gone to prison on a computer crime charge. By the time James got out of prison, his mother was seriously ill. In 2002, when the hacker was 18, she died of cancer. According to James Sr.'s recollections, his mother's passing finally plunged the teenager into depression, which he remained for the rest of his life. James dropped out of school, refused to go to work, and spent his time in seclusion in the same Pinecrest home from which he committed crimes. He took money to live on from a small trust fund left by his mother. Unfortunately, the hardships didn't end there. Despite the fact that Jonathan James completely changed his lifestyle after prison, the security services never left him alone. In January 2007 and then in May 2008, employees of the Secret Service of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security again appeared on the doorstep of the house in Pinecrest. They were investigating a high-profile case involving a series of massive hacker attacks on the country's major commercial and financial organizations. The group behind the attacks was led by Albert Gonzalez, who, between 2005 and 2007, along with associates, stole and resold data from 170 million Americans' bank cards. Among the affected companies were BJS Wholesale Club, DSW, Office Max, Boston Market, Barnes & Noble, Sports Authority, and TJ Maxx, which are little known in Russia but well known in the United States. Max. The first time the intelligence officials talked to James. When they returned a year and a half later, they conducted a full-blown search. Then they found nothing unusual in the house except for an officially registered shotgun and an old suicide note. The hacker wanted to commit suicide but changed his mind. Dealing with the authorities led 24-year-old James to despair and awakened long-dormant paranoid thoughts. After his release from prison, he seriously believed that the intelligence services were monitoring him and his movements. It was largely because of this that he had led a reclusive life, alienated even from his own father, but still on good terms with him. He was no longer particularly interested in the course of the investigation. He wanted to avoid becoming its figurehead. Personal victory or personal defeat became a fixed idea. James was not going to go to prison for a crime he had not committed. By that point, James dreamed only of freedom, believing he had become a juicy target for federal agents. In his head, he compared himself to Kevin Mitnick, considered the most wanted hacker in history, but thought his arrest would be 10 times more satisfying to the FBI and the sensation-hungry public. James left the note on the desk and went to the bathroom, where the shotgun had been lying for half a day. And I so ended the story of the first Pentagon hacker. Whether this death was the fault of the security services or James's constant depression, we will never know. But what we do know is that he left his mark on history forever.